Hello and welcome to News for English Learners. Vocabulary Matters. Today's article is about the UK economic situation and the dramatic slowdown that it has experienced recently due to a combination of high interest rates and high inflation rate. So as usual, we'll be reading it through together, paragraph by paragraph, and pausing along the way to check out some of the more interesting words. Hopefully this way, if you read along with me, you'll be able to learn a few new items of vocabulary. And don't forget to check out some of my earlier videos. I have around 20 other videos on various topics taken from the news, along with around about 50 short videos which focus just on one particular word or phrase, or sometimes I play a little game or I explain a feature of English vocabulary. So don't forget to check those out. And of course, please like the video. That really motivates me when you show that you have enjoyed it. So without further ado, let's move on to the first paragraph. The UK economy has flatlined in the last quarter of 2023 as the Bank of England's decision to raise interest rates to 2% has taken its toll on consumer spending and business investment. It was reported that gross domestic product, or GDP, grew by 0% in the 3 months to November, down from 0.4% in the previous quarter. The main drag on growth was the services sector, which accounts for about 80% of the economy. The sector shrank by 0.1% as households cut back on discretionary spending, such as eating out, entertainment, and travel. So looking at the first word we have highlighted here, this is the verb flatlined. And this is composed of two other words, that is the adjective flat and the noun line. Flat can be used as an adjective when we're describing a surface like a tabletop, that is flat, or if we're using it to describe a landscape, then that would mean there are no hills or mountains. Think of a country like the Netherlands. That's a very flat country without any hills or mountains. The second word, line, well, we can see a line here in this drawing. This is a line that is sloping upwards. It's part of an arrow, in fact. The term flatlined, I believe, comes from medicine. Now, if you've ever seen in a movie a patient that is in intensive care, usually they are connected to a lot of machinery that is monitoring their health, right? It's monitoring their breathing, it's monitoring their heart rate, etc. And usually on that machine, you can see a line that is moving constantly as it measures the patient's heartbeat. Usually there's a beep every so often as the heart beats. Now, if that patient has a heart attack and their heart stops beating, then the patient will flatline. In other words, that line that was moving and was beeping suddenly becomes flat. There's no movement because the heart has stopped. So that is the medical sense in which we use this word. Now, obviously here we're not talking about medicine, we're talking about the economy. So it's being used figuratively to suggest that the economy is almost experiencing the equivalent of a heart attack, right? It's in an emergency situation. It's in danger of dying almost, and it needs to be revived. That is the implication here. Now, moving on to the second phrase, we have, it has taken its toll. The word toll is often used when we're talking about traveling by car, because on certain roads, you have to pay a toll to use them. Usually these are faster roads like motorways or highways. In order to use them, usually you have to pass some kind of a barrier where you have to pay a toll to use them. Sometimes you have to pay a toll to use bridges as well. It's a certain amount of money. It's the price of using the bridge or the road. Now, in this case, again, it's used figuratively. We're not talking about making any kind of real payment in monetary terms. But when we say that something has taken its toll, figuratively, it means that there has been some kind of damage, or there has been some kind of negative impact. And in this case, it's the higher interest rates which have risen to 2% that have damaged consumer spending. They've had a negative impact on that and on business investment. So that is the sense it is used here. Moving on to the third phrase here, we have a phrasal verb, to cut back on. This is a three-part phrasal verb, so of course it is not separable. The noun always goes after it. Basically, if you're cutting back on something, it's very similar to cutting down on, almost identical, in fact, I would say. Both of those phrasal verbs mean that you are reducing, right? If you're making cuts, you're reducing. And in this case, households are reducing the amount of spending that they have on things that are not essential. So we call that discretionary spending. Things such as eating out in restaurants and entertainment, things that you can live without. Okay, so people are cutting back, they're reducing their spending on those, basically because they don't have as much money as they had before because of inflation. Everything's getting more expensive. So let's move on to the next paragraph. The manufacturing sector also contracted by 0.2% as businesses faced higher input costs and lower demand from both domestic and overseas markets. The construction sector was the only silver lining, growing by 0.8% thanks to a rebound in public infrastructure projects and private housing. Economists have warned that the outlook for the UK economy remains bleak, as inflation is expected to rise further in the coming months, eroding people's purchasing power and squeezing profit margins. The Bank of England has signalled that it will raise interest rates again in February to control inflation, but some analysts fear this could tip the economy into recession. So the first word we have here, or two words in fact, is part of a proverb, in fact. The full proverb is every cloud has a silver lining. In this case, only the second part of it is used. But if we think about the whole proverb, the cloud represents a problem or a bad situation that we are living through. And the silver lining could be seen if, for example, the sun was shining behind the cloud. Then sometimes you see a little outline, golden or silvery outline around that black cloud. So what it's saying is that with every bad situation represented by the cloud, there is a silver lining. There is some element of good that can come out of that. You just have to be positive and you have to look on the bright side. And in this particular case, in the article, that silver lining is the construction sector of the economy. All the other sectors of the economy are either showing no growth or they're contracting, whereas the construction sector has been growing by 0.8%. So that is a slight positive in an otherwise very negative analysis. Hence, we call it the silver lining. So, moving on to the next word, we have outlook. This is a noun. And you may be familiar with this word if you use Microsoft products, because there is a email program called Microsoft Outlook. It doesn't really help you to figure out what it means, however. An outlook is very similar to a prediction or a forecast. Therefore, it is very commonly used in combination with weather. We can talk about the weather outlook for the weekend if we are making a prediction as to whether it's going to rain or be sunny or be windy. And also we often look at the outlook for the economy. That is the prediction for how the economy is going to perform over the following weeks or months. And in this case, in this article, the economists have warned that the outlook is not very good. Basically, they're being very negative and they're saying in the next few weeks and months, things are not going to get better. And that is where we come to the next word, which is bleak. This adjective is used to describe the outlook in the article. And as I said, it's a negative word. If a situation is very bleak, it means there's not a lot of hope. There's not a lot of positivity. Things are not looking good. It can be used in a wide variety of situations, of course. For example, you could describe the weather as being very bleak if it's very cloudy and rainy and gloomy and you haven't seen the sun for many days. I would describe that as bleak weather. Equally, you could describe a landscape, perhaps an urban landscape with abandoned buildings, very dirty and dark and gloomy. That could also be described as a bleak urban landscape. Obviously, in this case, it's referring to, as we said, the economic forecast for the UK. It's not very good. And the reason is because inflation is expected to continue rising in the coming months. So looking at the next word, a combination of words here, we have profit margins. So basic profit is a business word that is used to describe the amount of money that a company or an individual makes from business activities. A margin, basically, the easiest way I think to think of that is to think of a piece of paper or a document. When you're writing on a piece of paper, quite often there's a space at the sides and at the top and the bottom. These are called, or commonly referred to as, the margins of the paper. So it's a relatively small gap, if you like, or space at the side of the paper. And in economics, the word margin is used to talk about the difference between two values. So if we're talking about profit margins, that would be the difference between your overall income and your costs. That margin is the amount of money that you're making, basically, through your business activities. So it's a metric, as usually expressed as a percentage. There are lots of different versions of profit margins, if you want to look into that, but that's quite a detailed economic analysis. I'm not going to go into that right now. So moving on to the next and final word in this paragraph, this is the word tip. Now, tip can be both a noun and a verb. If we are talking about a noun, then we can talk about the tip of a pen, for example. So it's very similar to the extremity or the end of something. We do have an expression which is the tip of the iceberg. When we say something is the tip of the iceberg, it basically means that it's a small part of it and most of it is hidden under the water. So perhaps if you're talking about a problem, you're saying that this particular issue is only a small part of a much bigger problem. It's the tip of the iceberg. But in this case, we're using it as a verb. As a verb, we talk about tipping when there's an imbalance. So if you imagine a very large, say, container of water that is balanced precariously, and if you fill that with water, let's say, there will come a point where the water, because it's heavy, will make the bucket tip over and all the water will spill out. And that is an illustration of a tipping point. So it's a point that is reached that causes a big impact of something. In this case, what it's saying is that these little increases in interest rates and the increases in the cost of doing business through inflation are going to tip the economy into recession. So they're going to have this big negative impact. You may hear climate scientists talk about tipping points, and the fact is that it's possible that these small incremental changes or increases in global temperatures may reach a point where they pass a particular threshold, a particular limit, and they initiate, through feedback mechanisms, a very dramatic and relatively quick change in the global climate. That would also be an example of a tipping point. Okay, so let's move on to the next and final paragraph. The UK economy is stuck between a rock and a hard place, said Paul Dales, chief UK economist at Capital Economics. On the one hand, it needs higher interest rates to bring inflation under control. But on the other hand, it can't afford higher interest rates because they will choke off growth. The Bank of England is in a very difficult position. Some business leaders have urged the government to provide more fiscal support to the economy, especially for the sectors that are most affected by the interest rate hikes. However, the government has insisted that it will stick to its plan to balance the budget by 2025. So the first phrase we have here, between a rock and a hard place, this is another idiomatic phrase. And we often use it to describe situations that are very difficult to find solutions to. Perhaps you have a dilemma. You have to decide between two bad options, if you like. That is the case here, right? Whatever the government does has bad implications, because if it raises interest rates, that's going to slow down the economy, and it's putting the economy in danger of going into recession. But if it does nothing, of course, the inflation rate will continue to rise uncontrolled, and that also has a bad negative impact on the economy. So either way, they face a difficult situation no matter what they do. And it's in those situations where we use this phrase, to be stuck between a rock and a hard place. So the second phrase we have here, this is a phrasal verb, to choke off growth. And the verb choke on its own is used when people are eating and perhaps they swallow something wrongly and it gets stuck in their windpipe and they can't breathe. Then we say that person is choking. And in those situations, you have to administer the Heimlich maneuver, where you pump air into the stomach and expel the food out of the mouth. So if somebody's choking, they can't breathe, right? Now, in this case, used as a phrasal verb, it's slightly different. But in essence, it basically means that growth is diminishing, is decreasing. So everything slows down, because that is the case here. When the interest rates increase, that makes the cost of borrowing more expensive. So businesses and individuals borrow less, which means they spend less, which of course affects growth negatively. Growth decreases, it's choked off. So moving on to the penultimate word we have here, this is the word hike. And you may have seen this before because it's a very common leisure time activity that a lot of people like to do. They like to get outside in nature and go hiking. That means that they put on their boots and pick up their backpacks and their walking sticks, and they go walking off into the mountains in nature. Very often, hiking involves going up. So that is the sense in which it is used here. Interest rates have been hiked. They have been increased. They have gone up in the same way that a hiker might go up a mountain. So that is the idiomatic use of that word in this case. So finally, we have this phrasal verb, stick to a plan. Now, let's start with the verb itself. To stick is an irregular verb, stick, stuck. And as a normal verb, it is used to describe, for example, situations where you break something and you use glue to permanently or semi-permanently put two objects or two parts of an object together. And normally we use glue to do that. You stick them together. In this case, it's used figuratively, because if you stick to a plan, you're not using glue, of course, but what you are doing is you're following through on what you promised to do. You do not deviate from your plan. You do not change your mind. You stick to it. So that is what the government is insisting here. It has made a plan to balance the budget by this deadline of 2025, and it is saying it's going to stick to that plan. It is not going to change its mind despite the negative economic data that has come out. So that's it for today. We've reached the end of today's article. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you have learned some new vocabulary. Don't forget to like the video if you have enjoyed it, and to check out some of my other videos.